My first expert exemplifies what I'm talking about. Jerry Colonna is the CEO and co-founder of Reboot.io, an executive coaching and leadership development firm dedicated to the notion that better humans make better leaders. Again, following this notion of leading from the perspective that you have, and the more you heal, the better this perspective you will have. He is the best-selling author of Reboot, Leadership and the Art of Growing Up, and has taken his own pain and used it for his own growth, and has therefore become a model of what we're talking about. So then he used his experience to effectively work with other leaders. He is a true model of courage and inspires all of those he works with. For nearly 20 years, Jerry has used his knowledge that he's gained as an investor, an executive, and a board member for more than 100 organizations to help entrepreneurs and others to lead with humility, resilience, and equanimity.
Good morning.
Good morning, Jerry. It's such a pleasure to see you and have you on this program with me. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Stephen. It's great to be with everybody.
Yeah, thank you. It's in the title, and you also note, Learning to Lead presents us with the chance to finally fully grow up. What is it that you are defining by fully growing up, and how does this message resonate?
Well, first of all, thanks again for having me on, and thanks for having this conversation. I think that I use the term growing up somewhat tongue-in-cheek. And what I really mean is the ability to fully actualize ourselves as adults, as the adult that we were born to be. So much of our life tends to be in reaction to the challenges of our childhood. We develop belief systems, we develop structures to respond to those. What I think is interesting is that we can use the process of leading to really unpack those structures so that we can make conscious choices about who we like to be as adults.
Mm-hmm. Great. I believe that inner work leads to outer results. Mm-hmm. I was impressed how willing you are to be vulnerable in your work with corporate leaders, and in general in going public. It really would be helpful if you can identify what allowed you to do this, or what gave you the courage to do so.
Well, it's kind of you to describe it as courageous in some ways. It didn't feel courageous. It felt natural. It felt it within integrity. I have a little bit of a pet peeve, which is that I have found that many leadership books and self-help books generally lack an understanding of who that person really is and where they've come from. And the result is that, and this may be due to my own childhood, I have a hard time trusting someone who has authority and agency if they don't actually show up as real people. Now, I happen to believe that that's true in organizations as well. And so what I wanted to do was show what I was talking about when I tell a client, for example, it's really important to show up as their full authentic self. Well, who am I to ask someone else to do that if I'm not willing to do it myself? That kind of hypocrisy doesn't sit well with me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As I read your book, which I really fully enjoyed reading, Jerry.
Thank you.
You had a breakdown in your work where you were very, very successful, but something inside of you just couldn't keep going. And it felt like that was the motivation to a great degree for your own exploration. What do you say?
Sorry, go ahead.
let me just check in with you on this. How do you address, how do you approach leaders who have not had that kind of a level of breakdown that serves as a motivating factor?
Well, I'll take it back a step first, which is I don't want to romanticize the breakdown. Okay. It's not necessary to experience trauma. It's not necessary to have a full-on breakdown. And what Stephen's referring to here is a level of depression that was evocative of my former suicidal ideation and even an earlier attempt at suicide. And that occurred in my late 30s. I don't wish that on anybody, nor do I think that that's necessary. Okay. So I want to just state that. But what I do suggest to people, and the reason I talk about that is I don't want people to end up in that place. I don't want them to feel the dissonance of being outwardly successful and inwardly miserable. And so I share that story almost as a cautionary tale. Do as I say now, not as I did then.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So one of the ways of thinking about this process is we can refer to it as revealing what's under the mask. We show one image of ourselves to the outside world, and then there's the other sense of ourselves that we don't show. But the revealing, again, goes against common beliefs that being vulnerable is either a weakness or can lead to being taken advantage of. How are you able to help leaders get past their resistance?
Well, first, I go first. Mm-hmm. And show them that it's okay. Mm-hmm. Because I think that as children, our little boys and our little girls are not taught what it means to actually fully be with our feelings. We you refer to those masks. We begin putting on those masks at a very, very early age. And you made the point that there's a danger implicit in being real and showing our feelings. And so I would argue that those of us, and I consider myself white, male, cisgendered, straight, those of us who have a certain amount of power and privilege, when we go first and reveal what might be called a vulnerability, we create space for those who might otherwise have even more difficulty to speak up. That modeling is maybe the most important thing a leader can do, because they create safety, psychological safety within an organization. If they step into a meeting and say, I'm overwhelmed, I have no idea what I'm doing. Can we work together as a team to figure this out?
So I appreciate you just sort of shifting from how you can create psychological space for the leaders based on you being vulnerable, to how leaders could do the same thing with the people that they work with. That they can set the stage, they can give permission, so to speak, for others if they're doing it themselves.
Yeah, and there's a little step that happens at the beginning, which is to be mindful of where the power dynamic is. You know, as a coach, if somebody comes to me in a very subtle way, I have the power, right? As a writer, as an author, I have power because I have a stage, right? And those of us who dedicate our lives to helping other people, part of that experience is to internalize the fact that in small, subtle ways we can have power. And when we use that power to create psychological safety and not use that power to reinforce the fearful places that cause us to put masks on in the first place, well, boy, howdy, we're doing a mitzvah, aren't we? We're doing a good deed in that way.
Yeah, right. I can appreciate that. Can you give some examples of leaders, companies you've worked with, and first, perhaps some of the difficulties that you encountered and how you addressed those?
Can you be more specific about the kinds of story you're asking for?
Yeah, so you're going into companies to help leaders, and I imagine some are more available to your message, to what you're asking of them than others. And just kind of give us a sense of some that maybe you had more difficulty with, how you were able to address, or what those difficulties were and how you were able to address them.
Well, I think, as your question implies, and even your earlier comments, I think you recognize that resistance, both the psychological nomenclature of resistance and just that word that we use generally, shows up in the individual work we do, but it also shows up in the organizational work we do. And so in many cases, people will come to myself or my colleagues or peers in the market and say, we're having this practical issue. I'll give you an example. We often get called in because organizations, senior leadership teams have trust problems. And I say, okay, I understand that. And I say, well, are you telling each other the truth? Oh, no. We don't trust each other. We can't tell each other the truth. Right? And so in that moment, the practical issue is we don't trust each other. We can't take risks. We can't innovate. And very, very quickly, we get down to the core issue, which is, well, you're not talking to each other. You're not telling each other the truth. You're not showing up authentically for fear of being vulnerable. Well, we can't build trust and therefore innovate our way to new ideas unless we begin telling each other the truth. Right? And so what I just did there, Stephen, that's a technique, if you will. I'm using their request, which is help us with this practical thing that is safe for me to describe, and then very quickly going in there. Another example of that, very briefly, probably the most common challenge that I run into with leadership teams is conflict avoidance. Okay. They don't want to address the elephant in the room. And everybody who's listening to this is probably smiling because we all experience this, right? And so one of the first things I will start to do is ask people about their childhood. And what you often find is that people were raised with conflict in the home. And like many people, we have two responses to conflict, right? Fight or flight. We either get aggressive or we disappear. And the conflict avoidant structures probably grew up with a lot of running away from conflict. And so we surface that so that the team can begin to tell each other the truth and create more trust within the organization.
Do you have much resistance when you ask them to go into their childhood to reflect on that?
I would say in the old days when I first started, I would have more resistance that way. Now I have a reputation for making people cry, so they know what they're signing up for when they talk to me. when they come in for me, they know they're going to say, "I need help," and I'm going to say, "Tell me about your father."
So that makes me wonder whether there's a little bit of a selective process going on. People who don't feel comfortable doing that may not come to you.
There's probably a little bit of confirmation bias going on and other techniques there for sure.
It would be helpful if you can maybe identify a couple of kind of interactions with leaders or situations that sort of highlighted how the looking inside gets then reflected in how leaders are able to lead better?
Well, I can speak to recent life events and current events, if you will. Man alive, has it been a difficult year, difficult 18 months. And I think back to about a year ago when so many of the Zoom calls I was doing with large teams was dealing with not only the consequences of lockdown and pandemic, but reckoning with racial injustice and a revelation in the connection to the underlying economic inequality that so marks our society. And many of the leaders that I work with turned to me and said, "What do I say?" And I said, "How about the truth?" So, but I don't know what to do. Let's start with that. What if you stood up in front of the team and said, "Boy, it's hard. And I wish I had the right answers, but I don't know what to do." The result was, for many organizations where the leaders were willing to stand there and sit, as I describe it, evoking my teacher Pema Trojan, the Buddhist nun, to sit like a mountain in the midst of a hurricane. The leaders who were able to do that, those teams today are bound together in the shared experience. We've all carried wounds from this last 18 months. It's an extraordinarily universal experience. But some have emerged on the other side stronger, tighter, more dedicated to purpose and mission. And I think it's in large part due to the leaders who were willing to stand up and say the truth of what they were feeling.
Yeah. I so agree with that, Jerry. A lot of times I encounter leaders who will become resistant to kind of going inside, to being vulnerable. And what they will verbalize to me is that, as we've just been saying, they feel it's a sign of weakness. And one of the things that I share with them is, if that's difficult for you to do, then that's really a sign of courage. That to do what's difficult, to do what's different, to do what's not prescribed by the system, that's what demonstrates courage.
I agree completely. I'll tell a quick little story about this. I remember one time I had a client who came to me and they were freaked out because they had received a term sheet for an investment. And at the very last minute, the investor pulled out. And he had said, he had told his team that they were going to get this investment. He said, "What do I tell the team?" And I, my quippy way, said, "How about the truth?" And he said, "But then they're going to leave." And then I said, "Would you rather them stay for a lie?" And that pause enabled him to go back to the team, explain what had happened, explain their cash challenge. And the result was that the team volunteered to take pay cuts to get the company through the cash problem. That pulled the team together because that CEO was willing to tell the truth and be brave.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Yeah, we see these lessons all around, that when you do the right thing, and not necessarily the easy thing, that you get better results. You get good results. Yeah. Can you talk about the importance of a leader having a clear purpose, and maybe some examples of working with executives to develop purpose?
It's funny that you speak to that. I was just talking to somebody this morning about it. I'm a little skeptical of purpose statements, mission statements, vision statements that grow out of traditional groupthink experiences. I like purpose that is driven from core questions that we carry. So, for example, I might say to a client, at the end of your tenure at this company, what would you like the people who work for you to know about and feel about the experience of having worked at the company? And the answer to that question might drive a value statement. When we talk about a sense of purpose, imagine saying to your grandchildren, this is how I spent 20 years of my life, making a difference in climate, making a difference to, say, healthcare access, making a difference, as I believe is true, easing the suffering that many business leaders have. How would you feel describing that? And then translate that back into a purpose statement, because that gets rooted in a sense of who we really are as people.
Mm-hmm.
And when we lead from that place, that's what we create, that inner and outer alignment that you were speaking about before.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So purpose that is derived in that way adds to our mental well-being and not just our strong leadership.
Right, right. What the leaders that you work with, how do they respond to your perspective on that?
I think at first they can be skeptical, right? Because I push up against the conventional wisdom that is promulgated in some cases. Here are the 5 things you have to do as a leader. Do these 5 things and then you're fine.
Mm-hmm.
But I was talking to a client just yesterday, and she we had begun working together in December, and she sort of looked at me and she said, "I can't believe the progress that I've made."
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing. And more important, how do you feel? She said, "I feel more confident than I've ever felt in my life."
Mm-hmm.
I said, "Look at that." She said, "But I didn't know it was happening all around me." I said, "That's the point." Meaning each session we progressed, but she didn't realize it was happening until she looks back and says, wait. And so now she's a convert for life to the methodology.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting notion of not knowing until you suddenly realize I'm handling situations differently than I used to.
Yeah, I mean, I'll draw from my own life. I spent 25 years in psychoanalysis with one therapist, and then after she passed away, I began working with another analyst, and I continue to work in psychoanalysis. And I remember at one point turning to Dr. Sayers, my first analyst, and I said, "I'm happy." And she said, "Mazel tov." I said, "No, you don't understand. I'm happy."
Mm-hmm.
She said, "Yeah, that's the way it works."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, it felt like it was sudden, but the truth is it was slow and step by step by step by step, I grew up and I became an adult.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the ways that I want to just check something out with you, one of the ways that I conceptualize how we frame our experience is that there's, if you look at the full range of experience, a lot of people focus on the bottom half. Their goal in life is just to get to things are okay. They worry, and then when are things going to be okay? And they very rarely go above that baseline to happiness and joy. and it's all about survival.
Hmm.
And one of the part of the title of my program today is about thriving, not just surviving. And I'm wondering if that's something that you've noticed in your work, that people are so stressed and kind of worried about what can go wrong, that it actually interferes with them moving above that sort of midpoint into areas of joy and happiness, and whether that's something that you kind of address in the work that you do with them.
I think that I think it does get in the way. And what occurs to me as I hear you describing that is the number of people for whom I think they reach the upper limit of happiness because they don't know that they deserve more than to just survive. And
Right.
there's something useful to their survival in believing that that's all they're entitled to.
Mm-hmm.
Because they learned at an early age, or as is often the case, the family lineage belief system
Mm-hmm.
is that we don't deserve more than just survival, especially if we're talking about the children or grandchildren of traumatic experiences, Holocaust survivors, pogrom survivors. There tends to be this upper limit on happiness that settles in.
Mm-hmm.
When you begin to work with someone and help them realize that, in Buddhism, we say that we're all born Buddhas. And the problem is that we forget this.
Mm-hmm.
So the process of growing up is a process of remembering that we're essentially good. And when we can begin to internalize that, all of a sudden the upper limits start to rise.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm not above using a trick like, would you like your children and grandchildren to have limiting beliefs like that? Would you like your progeny 2 generations down to continue to believe that survival is enough?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That usually
That hits home a lot more powerfully.
That's right. That's right. It's one of the tools that we use as children to survive is to say happiness is okay for everybody else, not for me.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And when we start to visualize that belief system being in people we love, it can start the rewiring process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very, very true. Yeah. In the last couple of minutes, can you speak to what you see as the results, the outer results that you see from the work that you've done with leaders?
I always tell my clients that my goal is for them to have financially successful companies where people are thrilled to come to work and do good work, and that they're bored at 4:00 on Friday afternoons, so they go home and play with their kids. And that's the outcome that I'm looking for, is that there's this natural balance that occurs where they feel connected to their lives in a really powerful way.
Mm-hmm.
The goal is not the most money in the world.
Mm-hmm.
The goal is not to die with the most toys. The goal is to live a good life and to be kind.
I would suggest, and you can tell me if I'm correct, I would suggest that companies that have leaders like that wind up having better bottom lines as well.
Yes, although sometimes the mendacious crowd wins out. I mean, sometimes bad leadership can result in a really strong financial performance, but that's not a reason why we should follow that path.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I think that the question is really creating sustained high quality output over the life of the company, over the life of your career. That's what's interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to participate in this program. You present a really, really important perspective that I am totally in alignment with. So I want to thank you as well for your courage in doing your work, which now is being shared by how you're working with others. Thank you so much, Jerry.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks for having me on the program today.
You're welcome. Okay. See you next time.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.